Hello, and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode is that egregious film known as Godzilla vs. Mothra. On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema, letter by letter. For each episode of a film miniseries topic, we cover 6 films that fit a C for classic, I for indie, N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Because who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I am Thomas, and you know what? If we release this on the right day, I just want to go ahead and give a shout out to all the mothers out there. I hope you had a happy Mothra's Day a couple days ago.
Yeesh.
Thank you, tip your waitresses, try the veal, etc.
Oh, hello. I am Bryan, and I also came to this podcast recording traveling by lava stream, so that's how I arrived here.
That's how you always arrive. You don't really have any kind of like vehicle of any sort. It's just traveling by lava.
Under the Philippine plate? Is that what they call it? Silly movie.
What? No. Not at all silly. What are you talking about?
These movies, the Heisei era.
Well, we should go ahead and introduce that we're not the only people here, because you might have heard a disgusted, sound over there at my brilliant Mothra's Day joke. He is a podcaster in his own right, and he's our special guest for today, Mr. Chris Luciantonio. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a little annoyed you snubbed my inch-high twin, but I'll get over it eventually.
You know, we have very personal problems with your inch-high twin.
We come as a pair.
He's off to the side, very bitter. But he's watching you record the entire time.
I'm going to have to deal with this entire time, and it's going to be awkward for me, so thanks, guys.
No problem. But yeah, so we decided to invite you on, Chris, because we're in the middle of our Godzilla series, and we wanted to have you on for at least one of these, because I know you are a kaiju fan your own right?
Oh, very much so, very much so. I am absolutely that kind of nerd and very proud of it.
And I'm curious, where did that start necessarily for you?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked, because I thought a lot about this. So essentially my admiration for the Godzilla series, it has followed a cycle throughout my entire life. So between like the ages of 14 and 18, when I was first getting into Japanese cinema, more as a curiosity and kind of like a first exposure to foreign films, I viewed the Godzilla films as like the coolest thing ever conceived for celluloid. Just these rubber-suited monsters, special effects, laden films, and just absolutely nonsensical silliness throughout the entirety of the franchise. Loved it, loved it, loved it. And then as I matured, to say between the ages of 20 and 26, and became an academic of cinema, that's where my appreciation for Godzilla became this much more rounded and nuanced opinion, where I was really enamored with the fact that Godzilla became this, in my mind, icon, this multivalent sign that can be deployed in so many different generations, contexts, cultural contexts, and nationalities, and essentially as this symbol for a generation, it could be molded into whatever you wanted it to be, and because of that, it's had this enduring popularity. And now, at my over-the-hill age of 30, I've come full circle to think, man, giant kaiju monsters are just cool again, and that's where I've landed on it all.
We all regress back to giant monsters are cool again, you know?
Hell yeah.
At a certain point.
Yeah, it's the platonic ideal of these films. It's just admiring big, stomping creatures.
Today we are covering our one film from the Heisei era of Godzilla, which we kind of introduced this whole era thing earlier in the miniseries, but basically the way that this is, the Godzilla films are structured, there's the Showa era, which ran from the original Gojira to Terror of Mechagodzilla. All these are named after, like in Japan, they sort of divide eras by who is currently emperor at that time. So they have the Showa era and then the Heisei era, which technically starts actually in 1989. So the initial Heisei era Godzilla movie, Return of Godzilla, is technically still part of the Showa era of Japan, but is the start of the particular, the Heisei era in terms of the continuity. And then the Millennium era, not based on, there was no Emperor Millennium. Though, I mean, that would be an awesome fucking ruler. Just like, I am Emperor Millennium. Though you set yourself for a precedent if, like, you're Emperor Millennium. It's like, all right, so for 1,000 years? Like, through the year 3000?
I'm pretty sure there is an anime called Emperor Millennium. I'm making that up.
I mean, it sounds right.
Now you have to start it.
That's true, yeah, you gotta start. We wouldn't have fact-checked you if you hadn't told us there wasn't. And then Reiwa era is like the current era they're doing, which is based off the current emperor. I'm curious, Chris, what is your opinion, especially of like the Heisei era, given we're talking about it today?
I would say it is pound per pound my favorite era. I feel like it hit an early stride with the return of Godzilla in, I believe, 85 was when that one came out. After completely losing the plot of the Showa era and taking a long-deserved nap, when the franchise finally came back in the Heisei era, it found this renewed creativity and darker subject matter for the character of Godzilla, and it was running within this very condensed decade or so, decade and a chunk of change. I feel like it is the strongest in terms of just pure creativity and interesting ideas of how exactly we can employ Godzilla and introduce it to a new generation. But with every single era, I find them all very interesting in their own right. Like, the Godzilla films are basically my children. I can't choose between them.
Especially in the Sophie's Choice of 38 Godzilla movies.
It's challenging.
Like, oh.
It is challenging. Nope, Son of Godzilla. That one gets the axe.
Yeah.
It's easier than I thought.
Not the first time Son of Godzilla has gotten dunked on this miniseries.
It's quite the punching bag.
Yeah,
no, that's very true. But Bryan, I know since our last record, you've actually gone through the Heisei era. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on this sort of era, which we should keep in mind is like from Return of Godzilla in 1984 until Godzilla vs. Destroya in 1995, and that's about 6-7 films, right?
Right around there, yeah.
Yeah. So I've seen all of them except for the first two, which are kind of just not really accessible on like streaming or anything.
Notably, most of the Heisei era movies honestly aren't that accessible in comparison to like most of the Showa stuff's on Criterion, and the Millennium era is like all over like Tubi or any like free streaming service. Mm-hmm. They're like pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, but those like first two, I just like I couldn't find them. I found the rest of them, and I went through all of them, and I find this era just so fascinating for Godzilla because, you know, the Showa era, I think, does go off the rails and kind of goes into some more, like, just ridiculous and silly and, you know, they kind of lose the plot a little bit, even though they try to kind of course correct by bringing back, like, you know, Ishiro Honda and stuff like that. But what I found so fascinating about the Heisei era is I do kind of agree with you, Chris, in a way, like, these are kind of my platonic ideal in some ways for a Godzilla movie. I love how, you know, they're very of their time, right? They're very 80s and 90s movies, or 90s. I've only seen the ones released in the 90s, but they're very much 90s movies. They're very steeped in just the, you know, one of the things I love about these movies is how much 90s tech are in these movies, like just the technology people use, the computers, like phones, cars, all that stuff is, you know, of the time. And I love that stuff. And I love kind of, you know, we talked about with the Showa era, like, I love, you know, 60s era sci-fi, right? Like the future scene through the 1960s. I also love just the future scene through the 1990s. It's just such a fascinating time of just what technology looked like. And these movies get very kind of, you know, tech and military kind of focused, which I find really interesting, actually. And I think it's kind of one of the more interesting elements of them. And they are much more grounded and a bit darker and a bit more serious, but I think they still kind of retain a lot of those goofier, sillier elements from the Showa era. And so I find this entire era fascinating. It's filled with so many weird oddities, I think. Like, each of them are just so unique and so weird, which you could say about the Showa era, but I think there's like it's like 15 movies. Like, there's so many.
Well, I think a big part of it also has to do with like the Heisei era in terms of like with my sort of Godzilla origins. Like, I was aware enough of Godzilla to where like I would look up a lot of like them on IMDb and stuff when I was younger, long before I'd seen pretty much any of them. And the Heisei era ones kind of appealed to me, if nothing else, because, and I say this as a positive, even though people have used this descriptor in a negative way, they're very toyetic, particularly even like the monsters themselves. They look like big toys in a way that I think is a compliment, especially with
absolutely.
like this era has a more consistent Godzilla design. Like, honestly, from Godzilla versus Biollante forward, it is pretty much like the same Godzilla suit, roughly, with like a few slight variations as things go along. And his design looks so much like the coolest Godzilla action figure I could have. And I think that's like really appealing, especially when you have them sort of in these big like model sets, which they like really pump up even more than like the Showa era was able to. Just like the model work is so detailed, and seeing Godzilla gets like smashed against these cityscapes and stuff like that is like really especially like wonderful in the Heisei era thing, where it almost feels like it could be in a toy store. And I think honestly, aside from probably like the Godzilla Jr. in Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, who just looks like a fucking Pokemon like plastic doll. Like, he truly looks like a fucking Charmander that I had as a kid, just painted green. But aside from that, really, like, I think they all have a sort of toyetic aesthetic in a way that is appealing, especially in these movies. Like, as you mentioned, Bryan, just gets so fucking wacky.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I think it comes with, I think, a lot of that advancements of visual effects, right? Obviously, like, the Showa era, like, they're in the 60s and 70s, and I think now that it's the 80s and 90s, I think you see the advancement of the visual effects. And the thing that kind of really struck me about these movies, especially going into them right after the Showa movies, is they feel very, very, very much inspired by American blockbusters in a way, or this new kind of, big blockbuster. It's very massive. They're like these huge sets, and there's just so much stuff going on. And they're very.
You couldn't
like,
tell from the cameo from Major Spielberg in Godzilla versus King Ghidorah.
Yeah, that I mean, especially there's so many Spielberg homages in this, though. Like, especially later in the Heisei era, where they're just doing like, stuff that feels like it's out of Jurassic Park or something like that.
Which is really funny considering, especially the Major Spielberg one was in the, I believe, what was it? It's Godzilla versus King Ghidorah. It's hard to remember.
It is the previous
believe
one
so,
before this.
Yes, which was in 1991. So before Jurassic Park even was a thing, the Major Spielberg.
Right.
But especially in that movie, they meet like much more of a traditional dinosaur version of Godzilla, who's like actual dinosaur size instead of like the kaiju size, which makes it even funnier. But sorry, you were saying, Bryan?
Well, yeah, I just like that whole notion that they are kind of inspired by, like, obviously the stuff that Spielberg is doing and like that Hollywood's doing with, like, in the 80s. And I find that interesting, the way that kind of like that influence kind of carries over into these movies, because they feel very big and large, and like they're trying to do a lot kind of plot wise as well. Like, if we were going to describe the plot of like some of these movies, we would be here like all night, because they are just like so complex and convoluted and messy in a really fun way, though. I really like the kind of, some of the plot elements of a lot of these movies. But yeah, I just find it interesting how they're kind of more influenced by all those blockbusters, and how they use that with that kind of toy-like quality of the visual effects and the suits.
Well,
and all that
if
stuff.
I could just speak on this like toyetic quality just for a moment, what's so great about
Please.
the Heisei era as like this first endeavor to completely redesign and remake these classic monster design for a new generation, that is just folded into the intrigue for this era. It's the first time we're getting a major redesign of Godzilla, of King Ghidorah, of Mothra. For fans of this franchise, it was the first time they're getting brand new design of some of their favorite characters. And building off of what you were saying, Brian, how these feel like much bigger movies, it's because with the 80s and moving into the 90s, when Japan, their film industry was really fighting against television, and they were nearing the end of their economic miracle, moving into their bursting of their bubble economy that was resulting from the post-World War II boom. They had to be big. They had to be as large as they possibly could for the time, because they were fighting tooth and nail at the box office against foreign films at the time. I mean, I'm sure you both looked up what beat out today's film at the box office for like the year-end totals in Japan.
Well, I believe wasn't it actually Jurassic Park?
It was actually Jurassic Park, and that was the only time that a Godzilla film ever got close to the top since the 60s.
That's true. Yeah, I believe this is the highest grossing since King Kong versus Godzilla. Gotta remember that's
right, and it's just at this time they had to stay competitive. They had to go big, or there probably wouldn't have been a future for more Godzilla films.
Well, especially because this is also around the era where Japan is actually also trying to get more into Hollywood as well, because there's all that stuff with like the John Peters, all that like crazy shit that was going on in like the early 90s. That actually kind of affected, especially like Last Action Hero, a previous subject of the show. It is so interesting, especially when you consider stuff like with the movie we were talking about previously, the Godzilla versus King Ghidorah. Like, literally, the reason that movie ended up having its time travel elements was because the previous film, Godzilla versus Biollante, had been beaten at the box office by Back to the Future 2. So they were just like, kids like time travel. Let's put time travel in here. And that movie does it in the most fucking insane way.
It does.
It's so fucking crazy.
Yeah, it does.
I don't know how you turn like a time travel plot into a strange play for Japanese nationalism. Like that is the underlying theme of that film when you look at it the right way. And that's bizarre for a fantasy-heavy time travel romp.
I mean, even though that does have like maybe my favorite moment of the whole Heisei era, which is that guy who was like part of the big platoon in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. Briefly, if you're not aware out there, there's a whole subplot that involves like this mission back in 1944, going to this island and seeing like a non-mutated version of Godzilla just living on this island casually. They never explain why a dinosaur is on an island in Japan in 1944, but you know, whatever. But this guy who's like leading the Japanese like battalion of the army, like is like very respectful of Godzilla and like gives him a salute as he's like being like dying from having like all these holes shot into him earlier by U.S. and Japanese military enforcements. He's just like, I respect you and honor you. And then in the present, in like the 1991 timeline, that guy is like a big corporate honcho and is like, oh, but I remember Godzilla. Godzilla and I have an understanding. We have a connection. And then Godzilla invades, and there's a great perspective shot of this guy in a skyscraper looking at where he's at a window that's at eye level with Godzilla, and they both stare at each other for a second, and Godzilla's like, hey, remember when you left me to die? Fuck you, man. And then he just destroys that building and crushes that dude. It's so good.
Yeah, God, that it is such a weird thing that like, you know, because I haven't seen the first two, so I would, you know, I wonder how those movies are in regards to this, but like it was funny kind of going into like, okay, we're going into the Heisei era. You know, I'm imagining they kind of want a kind of reset, right? Because the Showa era movies have gotten so ridiculous and like silly and whatever. And then like 3 movies in, they're doing like, okay, so there are time travelers from the 23rd century, and they, you know, like they're kind of doing the similar thing that like the Showa era movies did, right? Like with like Invasion of Astro Monster has like a very similar plot. But yeah, it's just that they're doing it with like this just incredibly like just this like a maximalist style, and just like, you know, so much weird plot stuff thrown at it and stuff like that. Yeah, I really like that movie though. It's a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
it is.
It is interesting because like Return of Godzilla actually does start on a much more serious note. Like that one, they ignore most of the Showa era movies, except it is a direct sequel to the 54 movie. And they keep saying like, oh, this happened previously in 1954, a thing that many of the reboots that would happen, whether Japanese or American, would try and do, to connect it straight to the original movie.
The Heisei era of the Godzilla films is exactly what David Gordon Green's Halloween trilogy is to the original film. Just all of that nonsense that was happening with the original run, forget it. The first one is a masterpiece, and we're just going to pick it up from there.
Mothra's not his sister anymore. It's all good. You don't need any of that baggage necessarily. But yeah, because so Return of Godzilla, it's much more straight faced, and then Godzilla vs. Biollante, which I'll be talking about a bit more later, is definitely like a bit more odd and is going for like that Spielberg influence really starts encroaching in, I would say, in that movie. But also, it's a weird ass movie that is just like dealing a lot with just a lot of like deeper emotional stuff involving this like new monster character. And so once that didn't do that, well, it's like fucking time travel, fucking weird redheaded white guys who are our villains. Which is so bizarre, and all this insane stuff that just like really barrels forward. And then, you know, we should mention we're here at Godzilla versus Mothra, notably, not to confuse it with the 1964 film Mothra versus Godzilla. If you notice, there's been a bit of a recurring thing of Godzilla didn't get top billing back in this day, usually. If he was with another monster, it's like, I don't know, King Kong's got seniority, and Mothra even had a bit of that, I guess, but at least had more star power in the mid-60s. But yeah, so Godzilla vs. Mothra is our E for Egregious pick for the season. I just want to get this out of the way right off the top, that I would not consider this necessarily a terrible Godzilla movie by any stretch. I would say, if anything, it's more middle of the pack, which is why I would at least kind of put it here, because like the main reason it's here is, one, I wanted to have a Heisei era movie. The way that all the others choosing for the movies picked out, I couldn't quite get a good Heisei era movie in here. But at the same time, I think this one is more indicative of all the things I like about the Heisei era, but also a lot of the problems I have with it overall. If nothing else, I think it's one of the more uneven Godzilla movies.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, like, even though this is not, even so far, I haven't dived into the Millennium era yet, but this is not the worst Godzilla movie by any stretch, but I think it is, in my opinion, I don't know how you guys feel about this, it might be my least favorite of the Heisei era, I think.
I would say Godzilla versus Space Godzilla is worse.
Sure.
There is some fun stuff in that movie, but I'd say that's probably worse. Also, if we're technically counting American cuts, one of my least favorite Godzilla movies is the Godzilla 1985, which is the American version of Return of Godzilla, which notably has Raymond Burr reprise his role from the American version of Gojira, Godzilla King of the Monsters, playing Steve Martin, which is, one, very funny in 62, but even more funny in that movie, the Godzilla 1985, because they just call him Mr. Martin, because by 1985, Steve Martin was a very famous movie star and comedian, which I just wish they just committed fully. Just get Steve in there.
That's funny.
Just have Steve react to like peak Steve Martin. Just, oh no, he hates these buildings.
Oh, that'd be such a clash with the tone of that film. I'd be here for it, honestly. That would have been very interesting to see.
I don't know, even though, one thing about Return of Godzilla, like, I don't like the design of Godzilla in that, but also all of his city destruction in that movie, because of his weird, like, he has like a weird kind of like lopsided eye thing in that movie. He looks drunk. And it looks like he's just falling over on buildings, just like, no, I'm good. Hold on. I'm gonna get up.
Hey man, that's the first time I ever related to Godzilla.
That's true. Sloppy drunk Godzilla.
What a hero for the times.
Truly. I feel like drunk Godzilla.
I didn't know that his character's name was Steve Martin. That's really, really funny to me.
Oh, for sure, yeah. But in that movie, like, literally, they just have him, like, in a completely separate environment, much like in Godzilla King of the Monsters, where he is just kind of, like, off the side, like, narrating, like, look at that big lizard going around destroying Tokyo. You really need me here.
Like literally, who's that for? Like, for the people, the fans of the original dub of Godzilla, called King of the Monsters, I believe. Were they really waiting for this dub of the Return of Godzilla thing? Like, if they don't get Raymond Burr back, we are asking for our ticket prices. Like, we
fucking riot.
Yeah, like, what are they thinking? Yeah, they're leaving money on the table.
No Burr, no...
Burrsness.
No show up, I don't know.
Hashtag not my Godzilla.
Well, it is interesting. I think I was reading a bit about the kind of subsequent to this Heisei era going on is like when the kind of early bubblings of an American Godzilla start.
Yes.
And we may get to that a bit later, but I think it is interesting that around this time, especially I was reading about the kind of like how they were trying to pitch Godzilla, like an American Godzilla, to like I think it was Sony or TriStar.
Well, I mean,
or something
Sony,
like that.
I believe, owned
And-
TriStar around that time.
Oh, right, that's true. Yeah, and just how like when the studio executive was just like, no, I don't see this, and it's weird to think though that like a Godzilla movie in America was like this like non-marketable, like non-commercial thing in the eyes of like studio executives, whereas like now like you have like, I mean, you know, these newer Godzilla movies like make a lot of money, like the American ones and even the Japanese ones make money in the US, and so it's interesting to think about this time where like an American Godzilla was just kind of not thought of, and so it was kind of like, let's bring back Raymond Burr.
Well, a big thing is to keep in mind with Godzilla is like around this time, like the sort of perception I think of like sort of baby boomers and Gen X, the people who were kind of like around that time about Godzilla was he was a joke. Like, oh, those are the rubber suit movies. Like those are silly and it doesn't really matter. I mean, like this is the same era where like Mystery Science Theater did a couple of the Showa era movies as episodes. So they were just like fodder to make fun of necessarily. And it is kind of a trouble because like obviously there's that whole thing where it's just like, oh, rubber suit monsters, what does that really like get you? How can like invested can you really be? You know, it feels like so dumb and silly. It's just I really love in the Showa and particularly in the Heisei era where everyone is just like 100% invested. Like there is no like jokey wink wink nudge nudge stuff. If there is, it's kind of like nods to the older movies, honestly. Usually. I think in this movie that might be a bit of a problem. This movie, I think it goes a bit more silly in a way that I'm not a fan of. More like kid movie humor bullshit. But
Yeah.
at the same time, like when these movies are just like very straight faced, like no, we have to stop these time traveling people from the 23rd century who try to convince us to get rid of Godzilla, but that's only because later on Japan will have a major superpower. In terms of the economy and like be the number one country around, so they have to get rid of Godzilla to make sure that we get destroyed by King Ghidorah.
Such a weird.
It's a solid plan.
What? I don't know. Well, it's very save the cat. It's very just like
it
very
is a very
traditional.
rock solid plan though. Well, yeah, and I mean, like it's what we talked about when we talked about like the new Godzilla movie, right? Like these kind of newer American ones where it is kind of that like child kind of humor and stuff like that. And another thing I kind of want to bring up, I guess, about the Heisei era in general, although it doesn't necessarily apply to what we're talking about today, but is this the G-force, which, as someone who is, you know, grew up in the 2000s, all I could think of was the fucking hamster movie.
Right. Yes.
Excuse me.
But,
Guinea pig movie G4. My
Oh,
God,
I am
guys.
So sorry.
Don't
to
disrespect
G-force.
true cinema like that. I have not seen those movies.
I saw it a long time ago. I don't remember anything about it, but every time they kept mentioning the G-force, I was just like, the guinea pig? Oh, no, yeah, right. It's the... But that's an interesting element, I think, of this movie, of, like, there is this kind of, like, task force, basically, or, like, a division that is, like, just handling Godzilla. And we get a lot of, like, recurring characters later on in the Heisei era. It kind of, I don't know, settles into a groove that I kind of like, of, like, okay, there's, like, the commander guy, and there's, she's in this movie, the woman who kind of has, like, ESP. I can't remember her name.
You mean, excuse me, the queen of the Heisei era, Miki.
Yes.
Miki Sagusa, played by Megumi Odaka. Who's in most of these from Godzilla vs. Biollante through Destroy. She's in all of them. No matter if she has anything to do or not, especially in the case of this movie.
So wasted.
So, such a bummer. I love Miki. Miki's such a weird character, especially considering her introduction is like Bryan in the first movie that she's in versus Biollante. She plays like this young woman who's starting a teaching job for the psychic children who are growing up in the wake of Godzilla's first attack. And so there's just a point where like she's like more of a supporting character, but she'll do like key things like she has a psychic stare down with Godzilla at one point, like on a boat. It's fucking so dope. And it's like, great, that's so cool. You have someone psychically connect with Godzilla. And really, in even versus King Ghidorah and in this movie, they just have nothing to do, really, with her. They have no idea.
Yeah, but it is kind of this interesting way that the Heisei era has tried to kind of loosely connect these movies in some way, right?
There is a bit of a continuity, right, with her, and like usually they'll have like something from the end of the last movie appear at the very beginning, and then they'll do their silly.
No, like every one of these films kind of begins with like, and where is Godzilla now? Still dormant. Great. Okay. Well, we'll just keep a pin on that and moving on. What's happening?
Godzilla is dormant for like the first 30 seconds of this movie, and then he just pops up out of the water.
And I mean, another thing I think about these movies I find kind of interesting is, like, I think all of them really treat Godzilla as, like, not a villain necessarily, right? Because often there is, like, a bigger bad that Godzilla has to fight, but, like, they definitely treat him like that sort of, like, just terror, right? And this massive thing that will destroy everyone if we don't, like, stop it
This malevolent,
somehow.
almost force of nature, yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I find that really interesting how, like, there is still that bit of, like, Godzilla being a bit of a mascot kind of thing, because I mean, he's just cool. Like, he's just, every time he pops up, he'll, like, the amount of times in this, like, era, he will just, like, come up out of, like, underwater, and then the music just kicks in, like, the Ifukube score, and it's great, and it's so fun to see. Like, I'm like, there he is, he's back.
But I think what's interesting about Godzilla is he kind of, in the Heisei era, he feels very much like he starts off much more like he is in the original film, pretty much. In Return of Godzilla, he is very much like a omnipotent force that's coming in. And then gradually he becomes, like you said, not quite a hero, but more like an anti-hero. So especially like by the time you get to Versus Destroya, he still is kind of like, he's a horrible threat that's kind of like, he's literally, in that movie, he starts off with a serious case of heartburn. And his inner core is just like bursting out with flame, and it turns out, oh, he has a nuclear reactor as a heart that's melting
this
down.
is all true.
So even though it's just like, oh, poor Godzilla's dying, but also if he dies, the entire Earth is gonna catch on fire.
Yeah, he can't take any Tums, though. It's not gonna do anything for him.
No, unfortunately.
Just another time when I've related to Godzilla. I also have terrible heartburn.
Definitely, yeah.
Well, you know what? We've been going on for a bit, and let's get into our movie. Let's get into Godzilla vs. Mothra. Here's the trailer for Godzilla vs. Mothra.
Godzilla.
インファントと
私たちはコスモス。
特別な使命を持った生き物なんですよ。
それでこの先何が起こるっていうの？
バトラもまたどこかで目を覚ましてはいないかということです。
地球 SOS。奴は我々の常識を超えた生物だ。
行方を見失ったか。
人類の未来をかけた戦いが始まる。ゴジラ対モスラ。
So Godzilla vs. Mothra came out December 12th, 1992. We should note the two big creatives here. There's Kazuki Omori, who wrote a bunch of these movies from, I believe, Versus Biollante, he wrote as well, yes, and then he wrote Versus King Ghidorah, this movie, and then Versus Destroya. And then Takayo Akawara also directed a bunch of most of the Heisei movies. He did Godzilla vs. Mothra, then Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, then Versus Destroya, and then he did do Godzilla 2000, which was the first of the Millennium Era, which Bryan, I noticed you saw recently as well, and I'm sure you're so excited about the Millennium Era based on that movie, right?
Gosh, man, that movie's bad. That movie's really bad. I unfortunately was only able to watch like the American version of it, but man, what a bad movie. And like, nice to see like a glimpse into like CGI Godzilla a bit more, but also I hate it, and I think that, like we were talking a bit like about that like guys in suits, like how kind of the perception of that was kind of like, oh, it's silly, it's stupid, but like I will take that in a million years over like the bad CGI.
Yeah, the N64 looking swimming Godzilla.
Technology wasn't there yet.
Oh,
It was not. We weren't ready for it.
No.
But God bless them, they tried.
No, we didn't have -1
No.
levels yet, kids, with our CG. No, not at all. With Godzilla vs. Mothra, which we should also goes by the title Godzilla and Mothra: The Battle for Earth, which is an interesting title. But
a good title.
at the same time, for Godzilla vs. Mothra, the middle point of the Heisei era. And I feel like especially after the last couple, especially like we were talking so much about versus King Ghidorah in the kind of intro for this. With this one, it feels very uneven, but I think particularly because there feels like there's an imbalance with the monsters in terms of you've got Godzilla, of course, and you've got Mothra. You know, they do not skimp on either of those in the title, not false advertising. But there's also Batra, who is this sort of giant black moth character, a sort of evil Mothra.
Yeah, twisted Mothra.
I just want to get off, like, the biggest problem I kind of have is, like, with Godzilla and Mothra, they obviously had a film previously together, which I think, despite the fact that you have, like, a guy in a suit versus Mothra who's often just, like, this flying kind of animatronic in the sky, I think that movie does a pretty good job of, like, having the two of them balance off each other, but having another moth, but not another person in a suit, I think puts Godzilla at a complete disadvantage. Not just in terms of a fight, but also just in terms of, like, he's just kind of, like, on the ground being like, hey, I'm jumping up. I'm trying to get to you. That's a lot of what he has to do in this movie.
And like, it's weird because I like the, like, design for Batara, but, like, yeah, it feels weird. And the plot for this movie is just, like, you know, all these plots are kind of convoluted and, like, messy and just kind of, you know, are kind of all over the place and very goofy and stuff. But, like, this one just feels like it is, like, so jumbled and kind of, like, I know this is kind of, like, cheap to say, but, like, this one's kind of boring in a lot of ways. Like, I don't think any of the other ones are necessarily boring, but, like, this one did kind of make me bored at some points. I don't know. It's a very weirdly paced and, like, plotted movie, I think.
But Chris, what do you think about this? I mean, what are your initial thoughts on Godzilla vs. Mothra?
My initial thoughts is this is where the Heisei era begins to repeat the mistakes of the Showa era in terms of attempting to widen the appeal of the Godzilla films to a larger and more family-friendly demographic. And in doing so, I think this film ends up alienating all of the fans that were brought on by the first two films of the Heisei era and were a little iffy with Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, but could nevertheless roll with the strange, fantastical elements that it was introducing into the mix. With Godzilla vs. Mothra, we are fully, well, not fully, we're half committing to a children's fantasy sort of film, much like the Showa era films inevitably experimented with. And in doing so, I think it loses a lot of the appeal, a lot of the tone that it was cultivating throughout the Heisei era. And to speak on your point, Thomas, about this unevenness with the characters and the battles of Godzilla versus Mothra, it does feel like, and I know for a fact, we both did the same research and found out that, like, this film began pre-production as a standalone Mothra film, and then through several rewrites, which is typical for most Godzilla films at the time, it became this trio of Godzilla, Mothra, and the new character Batra to entice fans like that you're getting something new with this, and not just a retread of Godzilla versus Mothra or Mothra versus Godzilla from the 60s. And yeah, it becomes a very strange mixture that doesn't necessarily work. It is beholden to too many tones, and the main issue I have, which we'll probably get into extensively, is the environmentalism angle of the entire film.
Message about the environment, Chris?
Oh, it was really subtle, so it might have gone
Right
over your head.
No,
much
I
like
think
Mothra
that's
would fly over it. But no, it beats you over the head with it, Thomas. You gotta open your eyes, man.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, with that sort of family element that you're mentioning, I think when you compare this to the 1964 movie Mothra vs. Godzilla, that's where I think the Showa era starts really hitting its stride in terms of being like very fanciful and very like friendly to like a whole family audience. But at the same time, there's a lot of like fun in the way that they implement sort of like the satirical elements of it, like the villains. Like I love in the beginning of Mothra vs. Godzilla when the egg first shows up. And there's people crowding all around it. And then there's like the business guy who ends up becoming one of the villains later. Comes up and it's just like, oh yes, we're gonna make sure to basically buy the egg, but we'll have everybody come around and take pictures. It's fine for a fee and stuff like that. It just feels like there's a bit more of like that kind of satire that's in there that's built in a really fun way versus like when we get to this movie, they try and implement that with our villains at one point when they talk about, oh, we'll take the twins here, the Cosmos as they're called, for like publicity. I don't know if that's gonna work when you kidnap these two fairies and you're gonna have them talk in interviews.
Not very well explained. Yeah,
I guess.
Their business strategy regarding like once they lose the egg, it seems like they were just making it up as they went along.
It feels very weird, especially because like in Mothra versus Godzilla, I think that also has like one of my favorite lines in that movie is like when they're like confronting the businessmen of like, hey, you can't do this, like it's their egg, like they own it, and he's like, oh, did Mothra give you power of attorney? Which is like genuinely funny, and like, you know, it also is like genuinely kind of like, you know, insightful into like just, you know, corporate like the corporate mindset and stuff like that. But like, and this movie has like my favorite like moment maybe of like that, which doesn't work as well, but I think is when like they're all like having a little meeting, and like he sees the two like the Cosmos, and he's like, you build a room inside this room for them, and the guy's like, how do I furnish a room for them? Like that's the closest I think this gets to like that level of kind of humor from like Mothra.
You're also
versus Godzilla,
forgetting like the boss's response of just like, well, go to a toy store, buy him a house with like Barbies. Just so good.
Well, and later we see him like digging through like the dollhouse. He like lifts the cover on like the little doll bed, which is kind of funny.
I will say though, there's a funnier version of that in a different movie featuring Mothra. I think we'll talk about it later, Chris, in the show. Maybe. But yeah, I think there are peaks of that. That's the thing is like when I say this movie's uneven, I think there are certain elements like I kind of like the opening bit of our main human character. It's basically the plot of this movie is that we start with obviously like Godzilla, as I mentioned, like is awoken within 30 seconds of this movie. That just comes out of the water, then the title pops up, and then we have this guy played by Tetsuya Bisho, who is a Indiana Jones stand-in ostensibly. Yeah. He is like literally going around inside this like giant like ancient temple where he's like running into booby traps. There's a point where he walks upstairs that like start disintegrating as he moves up them and shit like that. And he ends up getting this artifact that is stolen by his version of Belloc, which is his ex-wife. Am I right, fellas? When your ex-wife is kind of your Belloc.
I love this character of deadbeat dad Indiana Jones. I think this guy is great. I love Takuya Fujito. I love the human characters in this film generally. I think this is one place Godzilla vs. Mothra really knocks it out of the park.
I like the Indiana Jones aspect of him. But I think as the movie goes along, there's the other aspect of him and his ex-wife, which is sort of like the broken family dynamic, which I think is not as well developed. I don't think it's nearly as like emotionally investing, I think.
You didn't find it charming when he looked at where he was thinking about the larval stage of Mothra turning into an egg and thought like maybe we could all learn something from Mothra. No, that didn't warm your heart.
Yeah, yeah, and it's funny actually though because I've been watching all these movies and like the human elements can kind of blur into the background for me at times where I'm just kind of like I forget who's who and what character's doing what and just all that stuff. And I like this kind of like setup of the broken family. It's very Spielberg, of course, just like that Indiana Jones like opening and stuff, but like I like the setup and I think it's very kind of interesting the way he's kind of brought in and like has to work together with these guys. I like that element on paper. But yeah, the movie just doesn't handle it well in any way. Just like much like it handles its like environmental themes by having like the whole like just having an end speech that is it's very like after school special, like Masters of the Universe, like, and what lesson did we learn today and in this year's Godzilla movie. It just doesn't work entirely, but I don't know, I should like the setup, and I like the character. Like, I agree with you, Chris, like the characters are good in this movie, but yeah, the movie just is a bit of a mess.
Yeah, it feels like it kind of gets lost, and you mentioned sort of the various different plots of this, because like there's mention of like a meteorite that's gonna land on Earth initially. That's kind of like the big modus operandi for like, oh, things are kind of out of whack, which leads to like Mothra coming in and stuff like that. But they forget about that shit until the very end of the movie when the Cosmos are like, oh yeah, remember that fucking meteorite? Mothra's gonna take care of it. Bye.
Yeah. Just last minute rewrite of the entire setup that just re-inject it right into the climax to offer a little bit of symmetry, I guess. I totally get where you're going with that.
Tell me, like, Bryan or Chris, if you want to step in, because usually I do the plot synopsis, but I'm even trying to remember, like, what exactly does the artifact do again that he stole?
Oh, I was assuming that the artifact had absolutely nothing to do with the rest of the film. I totally thought that the initial meteor strike that awakens both Godzilla and Batra causes this cycle of very dangerous weather,
right,
which uncovers the egg of Mothras, and then creating this whole collision course between these three monsters.
Right, yeah, but then what's the reason that he even is, like, involved with this again? What's the setup that they have with him and his ex-wife?
Like, he's brought in, right, to, like...
He's the ringer, because he is an explorer, like, so he can...
Yeah.
Right, so they can search, that's right, for the temple and all that they have to get to, right, where we do find the art.
It's a poor setup, I will give you that.
Yeah. Well,
right.
They have the scene early on where, like, he's, like, in prison, right, and, like, they're like, we'll get you out of here if you, come help us with this, and, gosh, even you describing it, I'm just, like, it made me more confused on the plot
right,
of this movie.
as opposed to what I like about something like, say, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, where the characters are, like you mentioned, the human characters are kind of thin, but at the same time, they're plucky enough archetypes that are played, like, in a fun way. Like, the one guy who's the reporter, who is just like, oh, Godzilla's kind of, something I hope I can get paid for, and then later on, it's like, oh, you wrote this book, so you have to come with us. And it's like, I don't know if he knows that enough for a book, guys. You have the book. This is the past version of him. He hasn't written the book yet. I don't think he has any extra information that wouldn't be in the book.
Best bit there is how they tell him, yeah, nobody bought your book, by the way.
Yes. And then I think later he's, like, figuring out the title, and he's like, well, I already know what it's called, and, like, I already know what, like, all that stuff. And, yeah, it's pretty funny.
Right, that's fun, as opposed to, once again, you got, like, Takuya, who's, like, brought on this mission, but we should mention his wife, Masako, played by Satomi Kobayashi. With, like, the whole dynamic, just, it wants to be very Romancing the Stone, but I think once it becomes a lot more kind of like, what happened in our relationship? In theory, I would like an interesting exploration of that, but I just feel they're kind of like, I don't know, I guess we just drifted apart, because I'm an adventurer who isn't around at all. And you're actually raising our child.
I just couldn't help but steal ancient artifacts. It's my thing, and sorry, I can't be around with our child.
Yeah, I think, by the way, the kid, I think, is what kind of kills it for me. And I don't mind kid characters, necessarily. I can have fun with it, especially even in Godzilla movies. They can be fun. But their daughter is such a nothing of a character when she shows up, like, Mommy, hi. Hey, where's Daddy? Oh, I guess Daddy's not here. And then later on, like, Daddy, don't be a thief. Like, she is just a mouthpiece for all of, like, you should feel guilty. Main character.
Yeah, and it and like, again, I think all of this stuff, like, I like it on paper, right? This whole setup of this kind of broken family and how that kind of intersects with, like, a Godzilla movie, but the way that they've done it feels so out of place for this movie, because like we described, that plot with, like, Godzilla and the egg and the fucking meteorite and all that stuff is happening over there, and it's like, that's complex on its own. But you want to, like, tack on, like, these very complex, like, family dynamics in a movie that's, like, 100 minutes, basically. It doesn't feel like a right match, and especially because, like we mentioned, like, in a lot of the other movies, like versus King Ghidorah, like the characters are very just broadly written, and they're very they're archetypes, and they don't have this level of like detail and specificity to it, which just doesn't. Yeah, it feels really weird.
Well, slow down, Brian. We also have to add on a corrupt industrialist plot involving the Maritomo Company and their strip mining of Infant Island, and how, in fact, all of the events related to Godzilla, Mothra, and Batra are related to us killing the Earth.
Right. We there's also that like cave they find with like the prophecy like on it with
Right.
So that stuff is just it's so much. And like Chris, you mentioned earlier, like the fact that this script started out as like a Mothra solo movie or side movie, and that really makes sense, because like this just doesn't feel like a Godzilla movie in some ways. It does feel like it should be a Mothra led movie, and it feels like Godzilla has kind of been shoehorned in here, kind of like at the beginning where he's just like, and he's awake now, I guess.
Yeah, we were talking about Miki being underused. Godzilla, for God's sakes, feels underused in this film.
Yeah, that's true. It's kind of like he's getting top billing, but in the way that like certain actors would get top billing no matter where they are on the actual like list of importance. Godzilla should get the "and" for this movie, basically. Yeah. Where like he's got a solid supporting role, but it's literally a thing where he's there for the first act pretty much, and then he disappears for 40 minutes. And then he shows up at the end. And, like, Batra's also disappeared for a while, but at least Batra had, like, more of an interesting presence. I will say, I like a lot, particularly Batra as a larva in this movie. When Batra's initially, like, sort of in this initial state before he becomes Moth. Like, and especially that battle they have on the water, where initially it's like, when they're dragging this Mothra egg, Godzilla suddenly shows up in a way that I think works for just, like, my sort of logic for a lot of these kaiju movies is just, like, they have another sense about it, right? Like, the moment, just, like, immediately, I know the sonar goes off. There's another kaiju-related thing within 100,000 miles of me, so I'm heading over, and that battle that happens with, like, just born Mothra as a larva, and, like, she goes into the water, and especially when Mothra shows up having bitten Godzilla's tail, and Godzilla's in pain, and just has, like, that's great. That's, like, fun monster action stuff.
They do that in every Mothra film, and it's never not charming.
But, I mean, I also want to shout out, while we're talking about Godzilla, the guy who plays Godzilla here, and played Godzilla for the entire Heisei era, R.I.P., by the way, to Mr. Kapichiro Sasumi, who I think is, like, so great as Godzilla. Like, I think he's underrated as, like, Godzilla performer, if nothing else, because that thing we're talking about of him being kind of an anti-hero, I think he has that consistently throughout the whole Showa era, throughout the whole Heisei era. Partially because I love, like, the design of him. Always looks like he's at least grumpy.
Yes.
He might be, like, just mildly upset at best, basically. Just like, oh, you guys are here. Okay. And I think part of it is the weird articulation of his arms, which they feel a bit more limited even than, like, the Showa era usually had, in terms of just, like, their placement on this design. So he looks like he's constantly just, like, kind of wiggling his arms in frustration. Like, what the fuck's happening?
I think that's a shout out to finally giving a exact origin point for Godzilla as a mutated dinosaur that was just hanging out in the late 40s on an island. They wanted to give him stubbier, more T-Rex arms for this run, and just to remain that consistent with the biology, and I think it works. I think you hit the nail on the head. He seems like a much more pissed off entity.
Yeah, and it's what kind of works so well about these movies is, like, Godzilla is like you said earlier, Chris, like this terrifying force of nature. Like, he is, like, genuinely, like, terrifying in these movies. Like, you're not going to catch him jumping up and down like he did in the Showa era or anything. And it really works. I love the design of him in all these movies, and I love just his mannerisms and his just kind of the way he moves and stuff like that. Yeah, it is such a really, like, great performance, which is interesting because I think you know, having seen Godzilla 2000, like, you just lose so much of that with any kind of CGI, like, included, I think. But yeah, it still really retains a lot of those elements, which I love.
And you do also get kind of the sense of an arc with him, weirdly, over these movies. I would say, where he becomes gradually more and more, at least, like, affable, an anti-hero, and then eventually, by the very end, like I mentioned, there's all this horrible context going on, but that movie's very much like, we are paying tribute to someone who is passing. That movie is a eulogy for Godzilla, ostensibly. And it feels like we do kind of see, like, this guy's like, oh, man, I'm gonna miss this, like, asshole who kept, like, being... just stomping through and being a piece of shit in Tokyo. I miss this dude.
He essentially, through the course of the Heisei era, it becomes how, like, Londoners talk about the weather. Like, it's completely inconvenient, but without it, it just doesn't feel like home to these characters. I like how throughout the Heisei films, they build in all of this infrastructure for dealing with Godzilla as he is just a thing in reality that... Unfortunately, this is the hand we were dealt, and this giant monster that any moment could wake up and completely devastate our island nation, that's just how we live now. And throughout the entire Heisei era, like, you see little elements of Godzilla warning systems and things of that nature, and just how nonchalant everyone kind of treats it. Several of my favorite scenes throughout the Heisei era are just cut to news broadcasts where they are handed a piece of paper and it's like, and breaking news, Godzilla is on the run again.
Particularly, I forgot which one is. I think this might be versus Biollante. I can't remember where. It's like they interrupt like a person who's like
yes,
a
that is
horror
Biollante.
host. Oh, Bryan, it's so great. They have a guy who's like introducing a horror movie, like he's fucking Elvira, but he's just like, oh, we're gonna introduce this new horror film. Oh, and we have now a special interruption from the news.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and I love whenever they're just like, Godzilla's heading to like Kyoto, and it's like Kyoto Daily or whatever, like it's the newspaper. And it is, but that's what I love so much about like the G-force like angle of it whenever that kind of comes into fruition, because like it is just this like very sincere, very earnest, like, well, how would we deal with Godzilla in a kind of logistical sense if he was a real monster who resurfaced every once in a while to like, you know, cause some shit. And yeah, I love that stuff so much. It really like I think it really helps to kind of make these movies feel lived in and make these movies feel more grounded, but not necessarily feel more like, you know, gritty or realistic or whatever, but just more grounded as in like, this is how we have to handle this because this is
absolutely
a thing that happens now. And it's such a great element of these Heisei movies, which I think they kind of handle it a lot better than the new movies are with like Monarch and stuff like that, which is kind of a very similar thing.
Though I would argue in Godzilla vs. Mothra, we have an equivalent to that, I would say, with like the sort of the closest we get to the G-force thing you're talking about is like all those people who are watching on monitors, which includes Miki, who gets like fucking Rose Tico'd, quite frankly, in this movie so hard, like from Rise of Skywalker. But then also Akira Takarada, who was in a bunch of the Showa era movies, including the original Mothra versus Godzilla. And you know, he's there and he's looking at monitors. He does it very well. He's a very talented actor, but I don't know, there's not a lot there.
No, I will say that is an unfortunate crutch of the Heisei era. We get, like, they reuse the scene placing of a bunch of characters looking through, like, a command center location at the movie itself, at Godzilla and whatever monster who he's sharing billing with for that movie fighting. They reuse that a lot in the Heisei era. It's kind of unfortunate.
Yeah, but I think I would argue even in some of the other ones, there are at least like more creative sets, like in Versus Destroya. That is a lot of sequences. It's just like humans talking to each other, but they're in like weird different places, like big open areas, like with weird designs that feel futuristic, as opposed to this is very plain. It's like there's a fucking pale wall and monitors.
You know why that is? It's because for whatever reason in this film, and I say for whatever reason because we all know the reason, Godzilla is monitored by the Environmental Planning Bureau, not by the Japan Self-Defense Force.
Yeah, and I think like I agree with you, Thomas. Like I think the later movies I think get they get more interesting. I think in terms of like the sets of like, yeah, if you're gonna have people look at monitors, like I feel like one of the other ones, I can't remember which one, has like a room that looks like a sci-fi room, and it has just like so many like screens and just like just so very kind of tech heavy, which I kind of like. And I love also just anytime they are looking at like monitors and showing like, oh, this is the trajectory for Godzilla, and they'll show just a very 90s like graphic on the screen, like just like just like a dot moving in a certain direction or whatever, and it just looks very kind of old school in a way I really love.
It looks like something that was directly inspired by The Hunt for Red October.
Yes.
In terms of American blockbuster things we're talking about, there's a lot of like McTiernan-esque, like, oh, we're gonna have monitors and people looking around and stuff, but it's gonna be intense as they look at these monitors. Yeah. And also we'll have just occasional white people show up, which is always like the Heisei era does that a lot.
Yeah,
they do.
In terms of just like a lot of like white actors, and it's always like, oh shit, you guys are here. Someone's speaking English suddenly. Okay, whatever. Even this movie, I believe, like the opening bit of it is in English.
Yes.
Yes, it's like when the meteorite falls. Yeah,
right.
Which I love. I just in any of these movies, anytime the Americans are speaking English, and like it's just bad acting. I'm sorry, but like it's.
So shout out though. I want to mention him because it's in a different movie, but my favorite of that is Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, where that one villain white guy who is just Rob Reiner. Like he looks exactly like Rob Reiner. At least that's funny. The other time he's just like, oh, send Mechagodzilla. So dumb. Why wasn't Godzilla on the bucket list, everybody? I mean, he would have been perfect alongside Jack or Morgan, whoever.
No, just add him to the trio. Like now it's like,
oh, let's make it a
Jack,
trio.
Morgan, and Godzilla skydiving. I'd watch it.
Oh, the billing arguments on that. Who gets top billing there? To go back to kaiju a bit, I want to shout out Batra, at least at one point, as a larva, is played by one of my favorite names from this entire series in terms of cast members, Hurricane Ryu.
What a king.
What a fucking legend. He also was in, previously he played King Ghidorah in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, and after this he would play Baby Godzilla in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, and then in Versus Destroya, when he's full on like Godzilla Jr. I think he's also very fun alongside Satsuma when they play off each other really well, especially even when like Batra and Godzilla are fighting each other in the middle of the water. You get a real sense especially that he's like a fucking engine running. That's what I like about both Batra and Mothra in this movie in their larva forms. There's a lot of them just being like barreling through shit in where it's like there's just like a giant tank that's just fucking destroying shit.
There's the one scene near the end of Mothra going to reclaim the cosmos, and not even doing it malevolently, just absent-mindedly bulldozing its way through the cityscape is more terrifying than if it were done intentionally. It's just on a mission, and anything in its way is going to be crushed under the sheer weight of the larva. I don't know. I always found that scene rarely affecting.
What the Heisei these movies tend to do more of is the like battle in a cityscape, right? I feel like a lot of the Showa movies, although they had like battles in cities, often would have it be like a green like countryside kind of set or whatever.
Yes.
And these are like, no, it's like downtown, like Tokyo, downtown like Shibuya, whatever. Like I love all of the kind of destruction of the city sequences, like just seeing like these sets just be destroyed. And part of me is just like, my God, how much work like did that take to like set up and have to like, all that stuff, because it is so, these sets are like big, and they're like there's a I don't know, like a gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a height to them. They're tall sets.
It's a real sense of scale, which has like always been kind of inconsistent in Godzilla movies, just depending on like how exactly big Godzilla is. At any point, is he like gonna crush a skyscraper, or is he gonna like hug the skyscraper? Really depends on the movie. But I like that in these Heisei era movies, you get a full sense of like, speaking that toyetic element of it, they feel like model cities you would see like in some high-end model shop.
Oh yes.
Like they would have like a huge display of a city.
My favorite thing.
Yes, for sure.
That's
really why I think that's why men really were into train sets. Like back in like the 50s, 60s. It's really like a secret Godzilla kaiju fantasy. That's why Frank Sinatra really liked that.
That's why Neil Young likes it a lot too, yeah.
That's true. Yeah, I think they're both clearly influenced by Godzilla.
No, you're hitting a good point here because the final battle of this film takes place at a real location. It's a theme park in Yokohama, and the miniatures like have to mimic a real space that like theater goers at the time could go to, and they do it pretty 1-to-1. They are really intricate sets for these destruction scenes.
That's probably my favorite monster action in this is during the final battle when Batra picks up the Ferris wheel. And just fucking smashes into Godzilla, and he's just like on the ground, just like, oh god, this is too much fun for me.
Yeah, you just feel for this monster at that one point because nobody wants to get hit with a Ferris wheel. That's a bad time.
Yeah, and like that is, I think, the thing about the Heisei era that I love the most is kind of the battle sequences. Like, which I loved in the Showa era as well, but like, I think in the Heisei era, they really have, like I said, the sense of scale, and it really just feels like they are going bigger with the fight scenes in the cities, and the kind of destruction that we're seeing is so much more. Like, there's just so much more of it. Although I think, if I have anything negative to say about like the fight scenes at all, it would be that like most of them, the ones in the city at least, are set at night. And so, like, the sky, I'm using air quotes, the sky is kind of like, just kind of a black, kind of gray, just screen almost. It doesn't have that kind of, the thing it would have in, like, the Showa era ones where they were fighting in, like, daylight, and you would get a lot of, like, background. You see a lot of, like, mountains and stuff like that. That is something that kind of, like, very tiny thing that irked me. But otherwise, like, yeah, they're incredible action sequences.
Correct me if I'm wrong about this one. There's not as much as of that mountain range that was like in Power Rangers and shit. That one set that is at least in one sequence in most Godzilla movies, like the Showa era and a lot of the Heisei era. I don't think there's as much of that here, right?
No, I don't think so. I think with the Heisei era, they were really going for like a more urban setting for its battles. I mean, the only one we get close to that takes place at sea in this film.
Yeah.
Right, but I mean, I think in some of the other ones, like versus Mechagodzilla 2, I think has a bit of that.
Yeah, Mechagodzilla 2 does have a bit more of that, which is why I like that movie a lot, actually. But yeah, no, I think like even the one at sea, I think is pretty good, right? Like it's not like the daytime sequences look bad or anything, or it's not even like the nighttime sequences look bad, but it's just kind of an interesting thing to look at, kind of contrasting the Showa era versus the Heisei era.
I've always felt that like they went with some darker scenes for the battle sequences. One, because they're going for a darker and more violent tone, and it fits that much better. And two, because a lot of the battle sequences, due to the newly available technology and beefed up special effects, is very beam and energy heavy. Yeah. So it pops a lot better at night.
That's true, but I think there's also a tactility. Some of the other Heisei era movies, I think, have characters who don't have any of that work. Like, I love Rodan in versus Mechagodzilla 2, where he's like a fucking vulture at one point, trying to, like, peck out Godzilla's eyes. Yeah. It's one of my favorite, like, kaiju sequences in any of these movies, is that bit.
Yeah, like, one of my favorite from this film is Batra just trying to drill into Godzilla's stomach, like, in the middle of the sea, which is just so viscerally effective. Especially given Satsuma's performance.
Or later on when, while they're, like, flying, while Batra's got him, like, near the end of the movie, and Godzilla just, like, bites into him, and just he's got that goo running down, and he's bleeding goo out. Was
very cool. I really liked that. It felt very, like, these movies don't get, like, obviously that violent, but, like, that moment was like, oh my god, this is kind of gnarly. Like, it's really, really fucking cool. I love that moment. It is such a, like, really powerful, like, impactful moment.
Another one I would say is, in terms of, like, the non-battle stuff, just when Mothra has to get into the cocoon. And, like, there's that great shot of, like, spinning the silk, and then just having it all, like, cover, and it's just like, Mothra's gonna take a break. And then, gonna get ready for the finale, basically. That's its dressing room, getting ready to go full moth.
That's the Jake LaMotta in front of the mirror before going on stage.
Mothra gained a lot of weight for this role.
I mean,
like, really
they did. I will say, jumping off that, the hatching of Mothra in this film is one of the most like kind of awe-inspiring and gorgeous pieces of like kaiju action or like kaiju kind of fantasy I think you can find in the Heisei era. It is a beautiful sequence.
I agree. Yeah,
and a big reason for that, we should shout out just Akira Ikefube. This is one of his returning films in the Heisei era. And I think his score is wonderful, especially when he gets to utilize like some of the Mothra themes. I think works really well in this movie.
Totally agree. Yeah, it's a nice return to form. Not return to form, they didn't lose it, but a nice like way to reinterpret a lot of their famous scores that they did through this series and bring it into a new era.
yeah, and it's weird to think about like the fact that Ifukube had been like scoring the Godzilla movies since the original, and he's still doing it like into the 90s. Like that's just such a very weird thing to think about. And like I love all of the scores he does. Like they're so fun, and I love how he can kind of play on his own previous material. Like he kind of plays on the Godzilla theme, he kind of messes with it, he'll play it differently like depending on the movie and the situation and stuff like that. I really love it. I think it's great.
Well, especially when you consider, like, he did the scores for Versus King Ghidorah, Mothra, versus Mechagodzilla 2, and Destroya was his last one.
Right.
Before his passing. And I think he really did just take it to heart. Like, it felt like it was a good return. Like, you would figure, like, oh, if he was going to do that, it would be for, like, one movie. Or something like that. But he just, like, really committed to, like, the back half of the Heisei era in a really great way. And particularly with Destroya, it feels like it's a really good send-off of a score as well. Like, the final theme for Godzilla in that movie, over his death, is wonderful.
Have you guys ever heard of like the apocryphal story behind why he didn't score Return of Godzilla and like why he wasn't like on board when they were rebooting the franchise?
Remind me, I might have heard of this.
So essentially, it was reported, this turned out to be a complete lie, but when it was announced that the size of Godzilla for the Heisei era was going to be larger than the one in the Showa era, it was reported that he said something along the lines of like, I don't score monsters that big. Like he took a weird stance, like, no, it's too big, I can't write a score for that. And then it just turned out like, no, he was busy teaching at a university, like, teaching composing at the university, so he was kind of tied up.
I mean, it would be really funny if he was just like, no, too big.
Yeah,
I'm not touching that.
What like
is that maybe his reasoning for skipping Space Godzilla? Too big for me. Too many crystals.
Too many like that's obscene. My music has nothing to do with this.
God, that's really weird. And his scores are really like fun whenever they want to be. Even though, like, I mean, this is kind of an earlier one, but I love the like little jazzy score he gives like Mechagodzilla and like the Showa era ones like that. It's just, you know, it's that kind of thing of like, I feel like I've heard the Godzilla theme so many times like in the past few weeks watching these movies, and it doesn't ever get old, but also like it never fails to give me that like goosebumps feeling when I hear it, and like the ba-na-na-na, like when it really starts to kind of get going, incredible. But also he like just has these really fun and interesting scores for everything else as well.
I just want to interject with something. Like, we didn't mention this last week. We did Godzilla X Kong last week, and just it's Thomas Holkenberg, right, is the Junkie XL guy?
Yes.
Who did the score. That interview he fucking gave where he's just like, I don't know, I don't think that theme works in a modern way. Not this far after Godzilla -1 brilliantly used that main theme. What the fuck are you talking about?
Talking right
you moron.
Out of his ass. Like I would go as far as to say that is the most iconic movie theme ever written. It's up there for me. Like it puts me in an exact frame of mind to watch a giant monster. It is the perfect symbiosis of music and moving images. Junkie XL, what are you talking about?
You're demoted back to Junkie XL. We're going back to that Thomas. Yeah. The fellow Thomas is telling you this.
Yeah, and like, I mean, I like Junkie XL. He's made a lot of scores I love, but like his scores for those Godzilla movies are not that interesting. Like I couldn't really like tell you any kind of motif or whatever for any of those scores. Like they're not that interesting to me personally. Especially
with all the bad needle drops in Godzilla X Kong we didn't mention in our episode as well.
Oh my god, what were they
That thinking? I was made for loving you thing is like so bad. It's one of the worst things ever. But anyway, back to Godzilla versus Mothra. We're doing a lot of diversions from Godzilla versus Mothra.
Well,
here.
I mean, I want to ask you guys. I think I'm kind of curious. How do you feel about when Mothra does come out of her cocoon, her like, slight redesign, I guess, or her incarnation in the Heisei era? Like, how do you guys feel about the way that she looks and moves or whatever stuff like that?
Yes, Queen. I love it. Like I love this character design. Mothra, like, pound for pound, like, outside of Godzilla, I believe is still ranked as like the second most popular kaiju design within Japan and possibly internationally. And there's a reason. This is close to a perfect monster design. Like, I love this thing. I would buy a toy of it. I would get a tattoo of it. I love the design of Mothra.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like a really solid evolution from the Showa era, because like we've talked a lot about Mothra. Mothra has been featured a lot in these earlier movies. And by the way, I think we've been kind of mixing up pronouns, because I think the Heisei era doesn't really, especially this one, doesn't really define this incarnation of Mothra with any gender. I think the pronoun is it a lot of the time from people.
Oh, my apologies.
From the subtitles, as I remember it.
I think you're right. Yeah.
But it's just weird, because like I think they just there's a lot of the elements of that where the mythology of Mothra is like kind of whatever. But I do agree about the design, the actual look of this is like a solid step up from the Showa era, where Mothra was mostly just kind of like a really fun effect, but never really advanced that much, especially as those movies got cheaper. When Mothra would show up, look real ratty. With this design, I think it is such a great like reinvention that still feels fluffy. Like, I'm looking at it right now, and I think there is still a bit of that kind of like, oh, Mothra feels like it would be a perfect kind of like plush out of any of these.
No, yeah,
like, soft and warm, but at the same time, it's just like still insectoid enough. Like, I love its little legs that feel just creepy enough. As well, there's a good solid like kind of mix of like Mothra is like still intimidating in some way, even though it's so cute. Look at that moth.
Look at those bright blue eyes. How can you not want to hug it?
Oh, yes, that's very true.
That is what I could not stop thinking, like, while I was watching this one specifically, like, how soft.
Yeah.
Like I want a little plushie of like, this Mothra. Like, I kept thinking of that that like around the time King of the Monsters came out, the film critic Karen Hahn was just always tweeting like, "Let me touch Mothra," and I just I thought that during this movie, like, I love the design. I love how like the color on like the orange and like the yellow on her wings just like pops so much, and so like, I don't know, it's just like the perfect like color, and like, I love their legs, and I've always loved the kind of more like bulbous eyes, like the blue eyes, which like the newer kind of Hollywood ones have sort of moved away from, which I kind of dislike. But yeah, no, it's a really great design, and I love kind of when we finally see Mothra like in their true form and everything. But like, it's almost so good that I wish Mothra was in more of the movie in some ways, because it's just, I just want to look at it for like,
the effort they put into the texture on this puppet design is immaculate. Like, I love it.
Yeah.
Which I think is very well contrasted with Batra in his moth form when he shows up, where he just looks like very like prickly, and would just be like, I won't want to hug Batra because like, oh, I might get like pinched, especially by like those yellow, like those 3 yellow kind of tusks he has, like as a crown.
No,
basically.
Mothra is Gizmo and Batra is Stripe.
True, very true.
Yeah, I mean, Batra's like is like almost like a if we're saying like Mothra's for like plush, like a plushie, Batra's like a hard plastic toy, like one that like it hurts to like hold in your hand, but like is so like detailed in a way that I love. Like, the face is so like disgusting and gross, and does look like evil Mothra, like just kind of like, the twisted evil Mothra,
especially with also the wing design on Batra, where like it's black wings, but then like the other color almost looks like just fire has caught on it. Basically, it looks really just like it's the more metal version of Mothra just flying in.
yeah.
No, that's a good way to put it.
I like the kind of that kind of tactility, like that we're just talking about with all of these like designs for the characters. Like, I just love how Mothra looks so soft, and like there is this kind of genuine texture to these characters, which I love in these like movies where it is like a doll or whatever, like what's the word I'm trying to use?
Well, that kind of like childhood playtime thing that we're kind of dealing with in
Yeah.
this movie, like even like we mentioned, the whole like final battle of this movie in particular does feel just like a kid in the Godzilla suit is fighting with like the flying Mothra display that somehow got into the city model at the model shop. There's that tactility with like not just the way the miniatures look, but even just the way that like these characters interact off each other with these miniatures. There's a lot of good perspective shots of like seeing people kind of like run away from like Godzilla throughout the Heisei era. I think they kind of perfect that kind of like, oh, the monsters are in the background and we're in the foreground element of it. It's like some of the best compositing stuff.
Oh yeah, that stuff it looks very good, especially because they obviously did that a lot in the Showa era, and like not that it looks bad in the Showa era movies, but you can tell that the technology has just gotten like way better, and it just looks so much like more seamless. We haven't talked a lot about the cosmos, as they're called, like the Mothra's like liaisons or whatever.
That's true.
That's how I've been describing them.
We've talked about music. We haven't talked about our version of the Peanuts here.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yes, but yeah, called the Cosmos, played by
Yes.
Kaiko Imamura and Sayaka Asawa, so not twins, actually. But at the same time, I think like they're a solid version of this. You can't beat the Peanuts for me in like the first couple of those movies.
Yeah.
I think it's just like they just commit to that, establish it so wonderfully and with such charm. Versus, I think these two are like fun. Like their version of the Mothra song works, and even like some of the additional verses we get later on that really especially go into like Mothra fight the Great War. We're just like, okay, we're going a real far in terms of like Mothra, basically just really like committing to like, oh, you must destroy in order to help us all, Mothra. We love you so much.
Mixed messages there, but thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're fine. It's kind of one of my other problems with, or kind of general problems with this movie, is that like I like the idea of doing those characters again and bringing them back with Mothra. I think it's a nice kind of way to have those characters not necessarily be like exposition dumps necessarily, but like to explain to the human characters like what's going on. I think they do that really well in like the Showa movies, but like in here I don't know, they don't get a lot to do, although I love their like when they're singing to Mothra. I think that is such a like beautiful like moment, and such a like just, I don't know, really kind of made me like just it's very sweet and it's very beautiful. I love it, and even though I think they don't work necessarily the best with this movie, as not a lot of things do, because it's just such a mess, this movie, but yeah, I love that the kind of musical, I guess, sequences.
I do appreciate that when they were attempting to reboot Mothra for a new era, for this darker and more gritty Heisei era, they could not leave the cosmos in the past. Like, them and Mothra are a package deal, and it's kind of why this film is a little lopsided in my mind, is because it's a very fanciful spice you're adding to this film. And now it is pure fantasy, where the previous films could skew towards science fiction or more gritty realism. Now we are firmly in the realm of fantasy by including the cosmos, which is the smart thing to do. I don't want them outside of the Mothra mythos. I like that they're a package deal. It's just adding them into it. Now you have to really work around them, which is where you get like most of the film's comedy. And besides, for most of this film, they just get stolen a lot.
Yeah. Just in their fucking little doggy kennel, basically.
That's where they remain. And then whenever they're let out of the cage, it's to tell us that, yes, a meteorite is coming. Don't worry, Mothra's got it.
Yeah, we'll mention this, I think, a bit later in the show. There's a much better example of that in the Heisei era. That's just not in the Godzilla movie, because this is their only appearance in an actual Godzilla movie in this era, right?
Yes, I'm pretty sure.
If I remember correctly, yeah.
You know what's also interesting? I think in terms of the Peanuts, in terms of Mothra in general, the lore of this, it does feel like they're kind of going into this with like, hey, Mothra's pretty popular, right? Because a big thing, at least one of the rumors I heard, was the reason they were kind of trying to get Mothra off the ground is because that was a more popular monster with female audiences, particularly in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And so they wanted to kind of integrate that audience a bit more into their box office sales. And it worked for this movie, based on like we were talking about. Made 3.7 billion yen at the time, which is roughly, about $10 million, which is pretty solid considering 1 billion yen budget. With this one, it feels like they're definitely going into it with like, hey, Mothra's pretty well known. You all get it. Like, if I hadn't seen a Showa era movie, if I was, say, a new Godzilla viewer in that 90s period, I would be kind of like, okay, I like Mothra, but they're not really keying me. And just like, yeah, Mothra, whatever, it's fine. The painting on the wall, you're good. Mothra, she's great.
Mothra, she's great. I agree.
I mean, that is how they should market, most of these newer Godzilla movies. Mothra, you like her? Yeah, she's in this one. She's great.
You know what? We've been going for a bit about Godzilla vs. Mothra, and it feels like we're kind of running on steam about it. So, do we have any final thoughts on Godzilla vs. Mothra? We'll start with Chris. Any final thoughts?
Sure. Like I said at the beginning, all the Godzilla films outside of Son of Godzilla are my children, and I cannot hate them. I can just be disappointed in them. And with Godzilla vs. Mothra, I am slightly disappointed. You've hit the nail on the head with these. It is a mixed bag of interesting ideas that don't really pan out. We've only really touched on it, but again, I just really want to harp on the fact how many times this film stops dead in its tracks to turn to the camera and tell you how we should feel bad about the Earth coming to an end and how it's all our fault. Not wrong. You're not wrong, Godzilla vs. Mothra, but the preachiness in which you deliver that message really does not mix with the rest of this film. I wanted to like this so much more because Mothra is my queen and I love Godzilla, but this is just a very inert and uninteresting take on all characters involved.
I mean, yeah, I want to shout out real quick, we didn't mention him, but Makoto Otoke, who plays like the lead CEO villain, I would say he kind of gets the Saturday morning kind of cartoon villain vibes. I wish, like, if you were gonna do this, like, go full Captain Planet. Have, like, some fucking awful, piggy, evil guy who's like, no, I want to completely destroy the environment. Like, go for it.
They get close to it because the way he shouts at the rampaging monsters, like, go ahead, destroy everything. I'll rebuild it. I'll rebuild it all.
Yeah, he's like, I don't care. Do it.
Yeah, that's a good peak. I wish he was at, like, everyone was at that kind of level on the villain side of
And
this.
I wish that he wasn't the only, like, anti-environment character in the entirety of the film. Like, the Marutomo Corporation is this faceless organization that he's at the head of, and everybody else seems to agree in a chorus that we are hurting the planet Earth. Meanwhile, his big contribution is, I don't care.
Yeah.
So that just stepped out, especially after, like I mentioned, those two white, redheaded dudes who time travel from Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah are, like, so fun and so, like, delicious.
Interesting villains, yeah.
Just really embrace it. Yeah, truly. As opposed to, just that. But you know what, Bryan, any final lingering thoughts on Godzilla vs. Mothra?
Yeah, I mean, this is maybe my least favorite one of the Heisei era, like I said earlier. It's not bad by any means, and I don't think the Heisei has any bad movies, really. But yeah, it's a bit of a letdown, and it's a bit upsetting because I was getting ready for, like, an absolute banger, especially because, like, I had watched all the other Heisei ones. I enjoyed myself to varying degrees with those, but I had a great time, and so I was like, okay, this is a 90s take on Mothra. I'm so here for it, and yeah, it's a very mixed bag. I think the human stuff is good on paper, but it just gets bogged down by this very convoluted plot that I just, at a certain point, I just had to, like, let go and stop trying to follow it. Where I was just like, oh, Batra, he's the bad one. Yeah, they're fighting him. That's kind of how I ended up with this movie. But still, though, I think that there's great stuff in here still. I think the character designs are all great, like we mentioned. I love the battle sequences. I think across the board in the Heisei era, they are just really stunning. And I think you can tell also that they've just been doing this for a very long time. Like, it's just like they're iterating on what they had done with the Showa era with those action scenes. Yeah, it's just kind of a mixed bag, and it doesn't reach the highs of other Heisei era movies, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But yeah, not my least favorite Godzilla by any stretch of the imagination, but just kind of mid, as they say.
Yeah, I mean, I would generally agree with that. I think that's the frustrating thing, is that any of these Godzilla movies are going to have some kind of like really charming elements to them, really, like especially the Heisei era, like, you know, Space Godzilla. I'm not a huge fan of that. I like elements of something like that, even at its lowest of the Heisei era. And even this, like, there's like fun bits, like there's, I think, a really great sequence of shots I want to just shout out that we didn't mention, when Godzilla, after he's had the battle with Batra, which we didn't even mention, the underwater battle, that's kind of a cool idea, and it's just kind of like dark and you can't see anything.
Yeah.
And then they like disappear into like the crust of the earth, like, see you in 40 minutes. And when Godzilla shows up, the sequence of shots is like Godzilla shows up out of like from behind, you know, like fucking mountains, and it's just like in a fierce rage. Then Akira Ikufube's theme plays, and then right after that we cut immediately to Akira Takarada, like a big close-up of him. And I'm like, okay, that's just a cool sequence of events to happen. Kind of that thing you're talking about, Brian, like the goosebumps
Yes.
of
right.
that. Just like, we just the cherry on top is like, oh, it's him. Just looking at him again, so like, here we go again, everybody. But at the same time, yeah, there's just this frustration of like we mentioned, just the weird kind of plotting of the different kaiju that show up, the different model designs that are really cool, but then cutting to the human stuff that's happening within them that's like got cool ideas, but at the same time, just the ideas run thin for this 100-minute movie. Even they don't have a lot to fill up what's going on here, which is a shame, because like we said, it's a real point that, like we mentioned, kind of that continuity element. We should note that in the next movie, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, it starts off immediately with just like, hey, remember the other movie prior to the last one, where we had King Ghidorah have a mecha thing? Wasn't that cool? Well, guess what? We're going to use that mech technology to make Mechagodzilla. That's just within 30 seconds. Like, here we go. Like, the thing you would have wanted, honestly.
It's telling, I think, that it ignores versus Mothra and just was like, hey, that one 2 movies ago was cool. Remember that? We're gonna do stuff like that.
Yeah, it's just really telling, especially with just that continuity element we're talking about, that Godzilla vs. Mothra does feel kind of skippable. If you're wanting to like pare down, like if you don't want to commit to the full like watching all 38 Godzilla movies, like insane people would do.
I don't know who would do that.
Oh, I mean, we all had a lot of time on our hands over the pandemic, right?
That's literally why I watched the Heisei era movies. Yep. That's when that happened.
Yep.
But yeah, at the same time, with this one, it felt, if you want to like pare down, this is one that like is not extremely necessary. If you're a completionist, go for it. But it's definitely not one that I would recommend of like the, you know, if I'm recommending at least like a top 10. It's nowhere near there.
However, Mothra's in it. She's great.
That's true, and that is, you know,
Counterpoint.
I mean, but
Worth
counterpoint, I
something.
could recommend other great, much better, you know, movies with Mothra in them.
Ah, you got a point there. Damn.
Like, I don't know, maybe switch the title around, and I'd recommend that movie to you instead.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a better movie.
Yeah.
Right. Well, on that note, though, let's transition into our segment we do every single episode, Between the Lines. So, on every episode, Bryan, myself, and our guest, if we have one, recommend another film that relates, you know, somehow to the subject of the episode. Maybe it could be an alternate choice for an E for Egregious, or it could be something we'd recommend instead of the E for Egregious pick. And I'm going to start here with a movie we kind of referenced some elements of earlier. Godzilla vs. Biollante, which is the second film of the Heisei era, is one of my favorite Godzilla movies, truly. in the wake of Return of Godzilla, this is 5 years after that 84 movie where he was the first movie of the Heisei era. We see that the world's kind of moving along. There are psychics, like I mentioned earlier, who are kind of developing things. There's a cultural thing about Godzilla. There's a lot of great world building about like people going to like, the Godzilla Memorial kind of like building and stuff like that. And in the wake of Godzilla, there's a scientist who's kind of, studying like botany and plants and stuff. He, at one point, ends up having his daughter, who's there, is killed in the middle of things, and he ends up keeping her alive via like a rose bush petal, like a rose. And then that rose ends up also being a factor as he's studying Godzilla's cells that were left over from the previous attack. And those two things end up combining, which ends up creating Biollante, a big giant rose initially, who then turns into basically like an Audrey 2 and has like vines that show up. And then, Godzilla returns out of a fucking volcano, by the way, which is one of my favorite entrances Godzilla's ever had in one of these movies. And Godzilla's like, all right, I gotta fight this giant fucking plant thing, let's go. And there's like a lot of like fun adventure stuff that's going on in the actual, in the human story, but at the same time, there's this huge, like the whole story involving like this father who's just like, oh man, I want to keep my daughter alive somehow, and that just turned into the kaiju thing, basically like implying her soul is kind of in this thing. I just think it's such a fun, fascinating movie that has a lot of the sort of silliness of the Heisei era that we're mentioning. I think this is like the fights that Godzilla and Biollante have in this movie, particularly the one when Biollante is full on Audrey 2 and is like using its vines and like going through Godzilla's hands. Like Godzilla gets like stigmata basically from fucking Biollante in this movie. It's amazing, and there's green blood. It's so cool, and I'm describing so much, but you got to see it to believe it, truly. And it's such a bummer. Bryan mentioned earlier, this movie's not available really at all. I wanted to buy a Blu-ray for this movie. On eBay, it's $300.
I'm looking at it now.
And it's out of print.
$325, Thomas.
Oh, Jesus. Well, lucky that I went to a convention where I also caught COVID, so mixed bag. But along with COVID, I brought back a Blu-ray that I managed to get for about $20. I won't comment on how official it is here, maybe. But at the same time, that movie's not really available, and it's a bummer, and it's a real shame, and I'm definitely going to loan Bryan that Blu-ray, because I think he needs to see this movie. Are you excited at all by what I'm describing?
I am, yeah, and especially just because, like, I'm just so curious of it. And I was reading a bit about, like, how it got made, of, like, they had people basically submit, like, script ideas for Godzilla, and that was one of the ideas that, I guess, got picked, and they incorporated that into that movie, and it just seems like such a weird, strange movie, and yeah, I'd love to fill in those gaps of the Heisei era. So yeah, I would love to see it at some point. But weird that a lot of these aren't streaming or anything. Like,
yeah,
I don't know. I think I think Sony still owns the rights to these, like Sony Pictures, and like.
Well, I did see on that Biollante Blu-ray that's super expensive. I believe that's a Miramax release.
Oh, okay. Well,
a lot of red tape around that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I just the whole like the like rights issues and stuff like that is so unfortunate, especially because these movies are interesting, but also because like it feels like a great time now while Godzilla has had this like once again had a resurgence with like -1 and the American movies. Like it would be great for just more people who are like, hey, I loved -1 and I'm interested in X-Kong, I guess, and I would love to see older Godzilla movies, and like it'd be great if people like that could go and watch these Heisei movies, but yeah, it sucks.
Leaving money on the table. Godzilla vs. Biollante is my, like, canonically right now, second favorite Godzilla film. It's so up there for me. I love the concept. I love its nuanced approach to, like, bioengineering, wherein, like, the film we talked about today really fumbles its environmentalism message. I feel like that one's a much more nuanced and interesting look at this idea and treating Godzilla as a real entity in the world. And that film has my favorite image from any Godzilla film ever released, which is when Miki goes to the classroom of psychic children in like very panicked, and she asked them like, "So what have you been dreaming?" And they all hold up drawn pictures of Godzilla, and the score kicks in, and it's the most like awe-inspiring and yet terrifying images that Godzilla has ever produced.
Yes. But anyway, let's go ahead and move on. Bryan, what is your recommendation for Between the Lines?
Yes, my recommendation, which we have talked about a bit, is a movie I have. It keeps growing in my mind with how my fondness for it. I'm recommending Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla 2, which of course is the movie right after this, also of the Heisei era. It's the movie that introduces us to the, what is the exact thing? Okay, United Nations Godzilla Countermeasure Center, or the G-Force. And I think anyone who like sees Mechagodzilla kind of reverted to like my 8-year-old brain, where I'm just like, that is the coolest design I've ever seen for a monster or anything in my life. And I love the way that he's used in Mechagodzilla 2. Not just his design, which I think is like just instantly like incredible and just so iconic, and like maybe one of my favorite designs of these, in particular his design in this movie, but also just the way that he's used as a literal countermeasure to Godzilla. And I think that the way that it's incorporated into the plot of the movie and how they have that big battle, and it's just it really like sung for me. And I really love the kind of sequences of like that you get of like them building Mechagodzilla, basically. Like they remind me of like Evangelion, of just like these like mechs almost. Like it is that kind of energy, which I love. And I think this is also one that's filled with a lot of just 90s tech and 90s like sci-fi tech especially. But it's also such a weird plot. I mean, it is like it involves those like ESP having kids from before. It includes like baby Godzilla, right? Which they keep calling him baby, which is funny. Where they're just like, baby's not a weapon, which is just so funny to me. Yeah, it's such a strange movie. It's a bit goofier, I think. It is the Heisei era going a bit goofier and sillier, but I think it's just great. And I love the action sequences. I love like Mechagodzilla separates at a certain point of the movie, and that is just so cool, so great. Just my favorite little detail about Mechagodzilla is just how his like laser beam is like, it's like RGB, it's just so colorful. I love that stuff. Yeah, I just really like this movie. I don't know. Do you guys like this movie as much as me, or even at all?
I will say that I do very much enjoy Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. It feels like another course correction after Godzilla vs. Mothra, but in a better direction, rather than doing a wider appeal to family audiences. This one, Mechagodzilla 2, absolutely does the same thing, but in a more focused and interesting manner. And again, Bryan, I'm right there with you. Mechagodzilla just speaks to my lizard brain, and it just activates all the endorphins.
Yeah, just such a cool design. But yeah, what about you, Thomas?
But yeah, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. I mean, I do really like that one. I did rewatch that yesterday, and I think that one is a lot of fun. That's another one of those where I would say is like a solid kind of like introductory movie. Even though like that opening might confuse them for a bit, but it's like, I don't know, like they build a giant robot Godzilla to fight against Godzilla. It's fun. Rodan shows up. That's also cool.
Yeah.
And I think I will say though, probably my least favorite Mechagodzilla design, I would say, of like this, of the Toho ones. I'm not a big fan of like the one that's in Godzilla vs. Kong, the American film necessarily. But I think this one though in versus Mechagodzilla 2 is a bit too kind of chonky in terms of like I love chonky Godzilla, but I think on Mechagodzilla in particular, like with the face, like the I like kind of in the earlier Showa era movies, kind of like the more dangerous jaws of Mechagodzilla, like kind of like very pointy, as opposed to like this one kind of looks more like spiked, but in a more generic way to me. And I think it's just like because of what it is. It's more of like a mech in a more literal sense, as opposed to like a robotic kaiju. I think, it kind of goes with the territory, but it does feel like it's a bit more Power Rangers-y, which I love Power Ranger stuff. I kind of, there's part of my affection for Godzilla is that, but it feels a bit too much in that direction for me necessarily. At the same time, there's still plenty of fun stuff. The movie, I love Godzilla Jr. I think is my favorite version of Baby Godzilla to any degree.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I love the way that Heisei era movies do scale with, having kaiju who are human-sized and interact with the actual humans, like animatronics. That's where I kind of feel I agree with you, Brian, about sort of the Spielberg influence. But in a way that's just very affecting in this movie in particular. And that's also a way better use of Miki, having that connection, which really carries over into Space Godzilla and by Destroy especially. I love that Miki with that, she has a very sweet, almost I'm so obsessed with Godzilla at this point that I've kind of almost adopted Godzilla Jr. as a faraway parent. Which I think is really, especially there's that whole scene in Versus Destroya where they have her reference the other psychic who's just I want to have a family and stuff, and she's just oh yeah, I don't have one of those. She makes one of those faces. That's just a really great, I love the development of that character in the sort of trilogy that happens there at the end, and especially as she becomes a big part of the G-Force you were mentioning earlier, which also is a factor here. This is kind of the beginning of that, of her integration. But yeah, Chris, what about your recommendation for Between the Lines?
So in the tradition of Mothra's in it, she's great. I have selected 1996's Rebirth of Mothra. So what's interesting about the Heisei era and Mothra is that in a lot of cases, her appearance in films kind of represents a weird end of an era. Because during the production of Godzilla vs. Mothra, Ishiro Honda visited the set, and not soon after died one of the the original director of Godzilla, who shepherded so many of those films. And during this film, Rebirth of Mothra, the longtime producer of the Godzilla series, Tomoyuki Tanaka, this was the last film he produced before he unfortunately passed away, and he's considered, along with Hondo, one of the grandfathers of the series. But I'm surprising myself by selecting this film directed by Okihiro Yoneda, because this is the exact problem that I kind of had with the tone of Godzilla vs. Mothra, but more so, where Godzilla vs. Mothra kind of flirts with being a for kids film, but never fully commits. Rebirth of Mothra is a no bones about it, don't be fooled, for children. This is as close as the Mothra kind of kaiju film gets to being the never-ending story levels of fantasy for kids. Much like Gamera and Wu-Tang Clan, Mothra is for the children. And I think because of it, this film comes across as much more genuine, fun, and generally enjoyable to watch. Yes, it is very silly and convoluted, much like the film we talked about today. But in this case, with its plot involving the same form of evil prophesized villain in the form of a Ghidorah knockoff called Des Ghidorah, literally zapping the Japanese countryside of energy and destroying all Fort Station for its power. I think this plays a lot better, considering that it's speaking to a younger audience, and it can be a lot more fanciful and funny and go on these really fantastical digressions. The first, quote-unquote action scene is the two Cosmos, here renamed Laura and Maul, chasing around an evil version of the Cosmos named Belvira around a house and completely wrecking it with their laser beams, and they're both flying little versions of Des Ghidorah and Mothra. It's a silly good time, and I think because it has absolutely no qualms about being for kids, it's much more effective both in being entertaining and in its environmental message. I think it comes across as a lot more sincere and genuine because it is speaking to, the next generation. Children are our future, and Mothra is here to guide them into a prosperous future. Yeah, I'm surprised on revisit how much I liked it, because originally I completely wrote this film off as it's for kids, whatever. I don't want that for my kaiju films. I want like serious monster battles with rubber suits. Here though, I was just very taken with it in a way that I was surprised. And of course, it spawned an entire trilogy of Rebirth of Mothra films that like completely stemmed from the success of Godzilla for Mothra. So if I can thank that movie for anything, it's giving me this weird, bizarre fantasy film. Thomas, I believe you've seen this film, right?
I have seen the entire Rebirth of Mothra trilogy,
Hell
like
yeah.
a normal person. And that was part of my research for this episode. And I mean, I hadn't seen them before, and I gotta say, I think with Rebirth of Mothra from 1996, the original, it feels very much like watching a movie that I would definitely have had nostalgic feelings for if I watched this like on Sci-Fi Channel. I believe the second couple did air on Sci-Fi Channel. That was where 3 premiered by that point. Like, these were all direct-to-video in the US. But at the same time, like, it has so much like a 90s kids-specific charm that I do have a bit of nostalgia for in terms of just aesthetically. Like, that chase you're talking about is in the kitchen and living room of like the house that these 2 small human children, who are kind of our main human characters throughout this, are like, oh no, look, they're making a mess of the house.
Yeah.
And there's just like a kind of fun, almost Honey, I Shrunk the Kids kind of charm to it, which I also want to correct you, sir. There is a little tiny Mothra that the 2 twins fly on.
True, yes.
But the villain rides on my favorite thing about these movies. The reason I'm so glad they exist. Little Garu Garu, who I showed you a photo of, Bryan, I think a bit ago when we were planning the series, when I first saw Rebirth of Mothra. He's this little, like, dragon who's a robot, apparently. And he's so cute, and I love that little guy, and he's in all 3 of these movies. If there's anything I want, like, I have a couple of Godzilla toys, but I would so have a Garu Garu. Garu Garu is, like, one of the most adorable of these kaiju I think I've ever seen.
I forgot the smaller Mothra is named Fairy, and it's actually like a psychic projection of the larger Mothra.
Yes, right? These movies are very weird also.
They're wild.
Yes, because in this one, there's the whole doll thing, which we kind of referenced earlier, which I think is a great touch as well. How the kids are basically, like, they have to go on an airplane, because the whole plot basically is that, like, they have to go over to their dad's evil corporate headquarters, which is right on, like, the fucking forest. Like, he's a deforestation guy. That's how 90s, like, kids environmentalism this is. It's just like, oh no, they're destroying the natural forests. And that's how they awaken Mothra, basically, and eventually Desi Ghidorah, which I also think is an underrated design for King Ghidorah. There's like it's not like we mentioned, it's kind of a ripoff, but it's a lot more scaling, and it isn't golden in a way that almost feels like if you were gonna make a like majestic, not King Ghidorah, but Desi Ghidorah, like small, little. He feels like kind of perfect as a recreation of that. Versus King Ghidorah does show up in Rebirth of Mothra 3.
That's right.
Right, and I will say, has the best leg stuff, because there's actually a guy just, like, running around with those 3 heads, like, still, the marionette strings, they're, like, holding it up as well, but, yeah, Bryan, these movies are so wild, like, the second one involves, like, a pyramid and a little, Furby kind of kaiju who can pee on people, and that heals them?
Cool.
And at one point, there's a perspective shot of, like, one of the villains, like, oh no, I'm so bad they hurt, I'm gonna die. And there's a perspective shot of you watching as this thing pees on this character from your perspective.
Yes.
It also has, like, a weird turtle kind of monster. It also is kind of like a manta ray as well, and that doesn't have a shell. But then the third one has King Ghidorah, and there's also a time travel thing where Mothra goes back to prehistoric times, there are little, like, toy, basically, dinosaur animatronics that do move, but they're like the size of toys. So those are the innocent bystanders for King Ghidorah, is, like, because the whole thing is Mothra has to go back in time to, like, when King Ghidorah originally showed up on Earth, which is in, like, the Cretaceous era.
Yeah, this trilogy gets very wild. I will say that much.
Yeah, they're all very interesting, but I would agree that Rebirth of Mothra is the best one. Bryan, you haven't seen this one. Are you at all curious now that we've described it a bit for you?
I am curious. I had actually literally only heard of these movies like a few days ago, because I was like, oh, they made more Mothra movies. Okay, that actually makes sense. I didn't know anything about them until now, and I am curious to see them, but I don't know. That's you guys kind of sounded crazy for a little bit there. I'll be honest with you.
What? No. All 100% real plot points of all these fucking movies. These movies are wild.
If I can sell you on it, currently the Blu-ray of all three is listed for a much more reasonable $164.
Oh, Jesus.
Well, on that note, let's go ahead and repeat our titles like we usually do for Between the Lines as we get to the end here. My pick was the 1989 second film in the Heisei era, Godzilla vs. Biollante.
Yes, and mine was the 1993 Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2.
And my pick was the first entry in the Rebirth of Mothra trilogy that was released in 1996.
And we're going to go ahead and wrap up here, but we know we got to thank some people before we get out. We got to thank Burial Grid for our music for the show, purchases music at burialgrid.com. Thanks to Michelle Kyle for our artwork. Find her at MishKyle96 on Twitter. And thanks to our supporters on Patreon, patreon.com/cinema2letter, where for just $1 a month, you get to do stuff like, vote for certain episodes that we do in a season, at least one per season, you all get to pick. And then also, you get access to bonus stuff. Like, around this time, I think we would have had our Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes review.
Hell yeah.
And right after we did all 9 Planet of the Apes movies. Brian, you're currently going through those.
Yeah.
As we prep for the big Planet of the Apes retrospective we would have done in April previously on the Patreon. And are you even more hyped now as you're going through the series?
God, I had only seen the original, right? And I just wrapped up the original 5 movies today. And those movies are fucking weird as hell, let me tell you.
Hell yeah.
Oh man, I'm really excited to talk about those though. That'll be really fun.
And of course, also, are you excited for Kingdom?
Oh man, even
Coming out
more so now. Like, I'm getting really hyped for that movie. I'm really excited for it.
Yeah, and also around by the end of May, we'll have our Mad Max Fury Road commentary in prep for Furiosa, which I think at the time of this releasing is only about a week or so away. Oh, I can't wait to be there.
Yeah.
What a lovely day that will be. We'll definitely also review that movie on the Patreon for sure.
Absolutely.
But we have, just another person to thank here. We got to thank Chris, our guest. Thank you so much for being on the show, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, do you want to plug anything, where people can find you on the internet, any projects?
Oh, sure. If you want to follow me on the site that I still call Twitter, you can find my account at Cinema Creep. I don't do much film criticism, but anything that I have written in the past is archived either at Film Pulse or Film Cred. And I also host a podcast on an even more niche subject than Godzilla films. It's Cartoon Night in Canada, where me and my co-host every week go through a quote-unquote classic Canadian cartoon from our childhood and try and put it into modern context. It's the best way to sell that, I think.
Yeah, when I heard the idea for the premise of your show, I was so curious about what even would cross over with either of us in terms of that, since we're filthy Americans, Brian.
It's hard to say, but a running joke on the podcast is a lot of the stuff we cover is technically Canadian because it's a co-production that involves at least one Canadian studio, like animation studio or production studio, just so that we have things to cover for the podcast itself. So we've done stuff like Clone High, for example. That's technically Canadian.
Okay.
Oh, sure.
Well, listen to that for sure. It sounds like an interesting idea for a show, if nothing else. It's more exploratory. What do these Canadians watch in terms of cartoons?
Exactly. It's
Very
anthropological.
They're so different from us. How could they?
Once again, thank you, Chris, for being on. Really appreciate
my pleasure.
it.
This is a great
I
time.
think you especially, you have a really great sense about the kaiju. You are a worthy guest for the Titans.
Please, you can just call me a nerd. It's fine.
Well, look, we did that the moment we invited you on the show.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
That's what we do with anyone we invite on the show, very lovingly. Just hey, you want to come on and talk, nerd? We appreciate all of our guests. But we should also, kind of plug here. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, whatever hell site you surf at cinema2letter. And you can find me on Twitter and Letterboxd specifically at NotTheWho'sTommy. And I also do some writing at film-cred.com. And I just wanted to share that we're on the Talk Film Society podcast network. We love being here. And I just wanted to mention that over on the Patreon for Talk Film Society, patreon.com/Talk Film Society, if you subscribe over there at the 1080p tier, which is the $5 tier, you can currently listen to Record Party, which a friend of the show, Marcelo Pico, has created this new podcast in which people come on and talk about a movie via the soundtrack, which he has the vinyls for. It's based on his vinyl collection of soundtracks that he has. And I was on the first episode, which is up now currently, in which the two of us talked about the Royal Tenenbaums. So we talked about the movie and also talk about its various soundtrack choices. Obviously a Wes Anderson movie. A lot of different great needle drops that are in there. And so if you sign up for that, you'd be able to hear Marcel and myself talk about that great movie and the soundtrack for it as well. And I'm the first of 6 episodes for the initial season. A lot of great movies and a lot of great people and guests lined up to talk to Marcelo over there. So over at the Talk Film Society Patreon, if you join the $5 tier, you'll be able to hear my episode and all the other great episodes of that particular show, as well as a bunch of great bonus content over there, like the commentaries that Marcelo and other friend of the show, Siobhan Irving, do, the commentaries that they do monthly. A lot of fun stuff there. They're currently in the middle of Matrix, which is all them doing all the Matrix commentaries. You can get that if you just sign up for the $1 tier over there. But regardless, the $5 tier gets you that Record Party episode and really helps out our home here at Talk Film Society.
Yes, and you can also find me on Twitter at BRYANDRADE and the number 3. Or you can follow me on Letterboxd, where I'm much more active. Speaking of Planet of the Apes, I've started to, make a list, rank them, so that's fun. So yeah, follow me on there.
The ranking of the Planet of the Apes. My actual list title.
That's pretty good.
Well, on that note, you can listen to us by subscribing on Apple Podcasts or whatever other podcasting platform you use. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, why not listen to all the other great shows that are on the network? And you can also dig into the archives in our Podbean main feed for the past 4 seasons of Cinema to the Letter, and also the old Double Edge Double Bill stuff. If you can't help us by supporting the Patreon for the $1, that's cool. Money can be tight for people, but the free way to help us out is to rate, review, or simply share the show around so it gives us more visibility. Be the Mothra for us to fly on. You are the wind beneath our wings. Please.
Nice.
Send us off like Mothra into the sky at the end to, I guess, get rid of that meteor. Very slowly. Bye, Mothra. Goodbye. On that note, we should tease our next episode. Mothra will return as we cover our M for Masterpiece. How appropriate for Mothra to return for our M episode. It's really M for Mothra next week. But also a couple other kaiju as we move into the Millennium Era. And we talk about Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All -out Attack from 2001. A movie I'm very excited to talk about. I've said before on the mini episode, I might stick to it. I don't know how things might change with the rewatch. This is my favorite Godzilla movie. I have a lot of things to say about it. I think it's very entertaining. Chris, have you seen this one? Are you a fan?
I have, and you absolutely called it with leaving it for your masterpiece selection. It is a wild time. It is a mouthful of a title for a mouthful of a film.
Yep. Maximalist masterpiece. Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah. Giant Monsters All -out Attack. Brian, you haven't seen this one yet.
No. Yes, I'm one movie into the Millennium Era so far. Not a great start, but you have really kind of set this movie high for me. I'm very curious by it. I'm also just very curious to see where the Millennium Era goes, especially post the Roland Emmerich movie, which that's a fucking awful movie. I'll leave that here at the end. That movie, I fucking hated that movie so much.
Just a parting shot at it.
We can't get into Godzilla 1998 right now. No, and that's also very key to the Millennium Era in general. Chris, are you a fan of the Millennium Era, just real quick, in general?
By and large, I think it's a much more mixed bag than the Heisei era, but I do very much appreciate where the technology was at the time. I think that's, if you're going to work your way to the Millennium Era, that's where you really see the sudden sophistication in a lot of their effects work.
Okay.
I mean, especially as that's kind of like, I don't know, it's the end of Godzilla in the sort of suit form, basically.
Yeah, it is the send-off. It is quite literally a send-off, because there'd be a long dormant period before we got another Japanese-produced Godzilla film.
But we'll get into all that next time. Until then, everybody, I think we're just going to drop out of this, like, Mothra drops Godzilla and Batra into the ocean, which we didn't talk about, but is one of the best moments of this movie. Just, boom, they're gone. Just like this episode. Good night, everybody.